So I guess the big question in your book, the big question is why aren't ordinary Russians more outraged by Putin's invasion of Ukraine? So I'll ask why.
Partly for the reasons been we sort of started to discuss there, because it fits within their understanding that they've had, for 8 years before the full-scale invasion, of what is happening in Ukraine. And it makes sense. So you started talking about propaganda, and of course it is propaganda, but I think often people talking about disinformation, they like to find sort of, you know, troll factories, and they like to add up how many words about this bioweapon pigeon or this, whatever they're called, militarized mosquitoes, I think is the latest one. But that doesn't really tell us a lot. That just tells us about one kind of drop in the ocean tale. What we need to look at much more is what's in popular culture and what are the core narratives, because narratives aren't really about facts, they're about making meaning. And I think that's one of the areas where there's a real lack of understanding of why ordinary Russians justify the war. And that's because the stories that the Kremlin tells, and it's not just the Kremlin, also, there are certain media actors. The media actors depend on advertising. People want to watch this to a certain extent. It fits with what they want to hear, and it plays on their feelings of humiliation from the collapse of the Soviet Union, from when they couldn't feed their families, when they lost status, when they lost a whole ideological framework and way of seeing the world. And, the 90s were a difficult time for Russia. And it also deals with that sense of triumph, that sense of, what, not only are Russians a nation, but they are really special because it was they who won the Great Patriotic War. And now look, you have countries like Ukraine, or in their view, or the Baltic states, or the West, who are dismissing that, or worse, trying to destroy the memory. And again, I mean, the war in Ukraine started in 2014, and how it was depicted was always as, this is just like the Great Patriotic War. We, Russians, and who they saw as good Ukrainians who supported Russia, must defend the memory of the Great Patriotic War, which those fascists, i.e., Ukrainians who wanted to live in a democratic state, with some accountability for wild nepotism, they are actually just fascists who are backed by the West. They have no agency. The West has put Nazis in power. And for me, I mean, even when I speak to people, because of course, this is my second book, but in many ways it's the prequel towards my first book, because I wrote Memory Makers first. And in Russia's War, I look at why Russians support or justify or go along with the war, the big full-scale war. And in many ways, you just can't really separate them, because the two books, to me, certainly, of course, I can't separate them. But the I speak to people who don't support the war as well, Russians, and they will still say things like they were idiots for letting fascists and Nazis take power. It's really, really very powerful. And it gives you it's almost like a menu, and you pick the bits that allow you to come to terms with, bluntly, the crimes, the awfulness, the horror that your country is committing, or to dismiss it completely.